My name is Lucas Whitmore, and for as long as I can remember, hiking has been my escape. You know, the kind of escape where you feel like you're leaving everything behind. The noise of life, the stress, the endless cycle of responsibilities. I've been hiking for over 15 years, maybe more. I've done everything from simple day hikes to multi-day treks in some of the most challenging terrains. And to be honest, I've always prided myself on being prepared. I'm the guy who never forgets his map, knows how to read a compass, and has a backpack full of survival gear even for a casual hike. I don't take chances in the wild, not after all these years. But the Cascade Mountains, they were different. I mean, they've always held this strange allure for me. Something about their rugged beauty, the way the fog wraps around the peaks in the morning, how the air feels just a little heavier, a little more alive. It was the kind of place that whispered to you, invited you in while reminding you that you didn't belong, and yet I kept going back. Maybe it was the challenge. Maybe I was chasing something I didn't quite understand. Last year, around late summer, a few of us decided to hit one of the more remote trails in the Cascades. We were a tight-knit group of hikers. There was Eric, who I'd known since college, a real outdoorsman, always cracking jokes but knew his stuff. Then there was Rachel, quiet but tough, the kind of person who would keep going even when the rest of us were ready to drop. And Matt, the youngest of us, a little green but eager to prove himself. I had no doubts about any of them. We'd been on countless hikes together, through all sorts of terrain and weather. This was supposed to be just another weekend getaway. Nothing more. We started off like we always did, with excitement, gear packed perfectly, and our spirits high. The first day was incredible. The trail took us through dense forests, with rays of sunlight cutting through the trees in these beautiful beams. You could hear the distant sound of a river rushing somewhere below, birds calling out. The kind of peace you only find out there, far from everything. I guess what I'm saying is, everything seemed perfect. But looking back, it was too perfect. The kind of perfect that lulls you into a sense of security, that makes you think nothing can go wrong. The second day is when things started to shift. I don't know, maybe we were too relaxed, too comfortable with how the first day had gone. We had set up camp near this small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that made it feel like we were in the middle of nowhere. Honestly, that's what we wanted, to be cut off from everything, just us and nature. That morning I remember waking up before the others. The sun was barely creeping over the horizon, the air still cool, and there was this strange quietness, not the peaceful kind though. More like everything had stopped, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off as just being overly aware of my surroundings. But then I saw them, the footprints. They were scattered around the edges of our camp, just far enough to not be immediately noticeable. But once you spotted them, you couldn't unsee them. Barefoot, deep impressions in the dirt, larger than any human foot I've ever seen. My first thought was that maybe someone from the group had wandered around in the night. But these prints, they weren't fresh. And besides, who walks around barefoot in the woods in the middle of the night? It didn't make sense. When the others woke up, I pointed them out, expecting some logical explanation, maybe even a laugh. But no one laughed. Eric, usually the one to joke about everything, just stared at them. Rachel shrugged it off, saying it was probably some animal, though even she didn't sound convinced. Matt was quiet, too quiet. He just stood there, looking at the footprints like they made him uncomfortable. We packed up camp, brushed it off as nothing, because what else were we going to do? Turn back over some weird tracks? Nah, we were too stubborn for that. But as we hiked deeper into the trail, I couldn't shake this feeling. You know that feeling when you're sure someone's watching you, but every time you turn around, there's no one there? Yeah, it was like that. The footprints. They followed us, not directly on the trail, but just off to the side, always there, just out of sight unless you looked for them. Every time we stopped to rest, I'd glance down and there they were, a little fresher, a little closer. At first, we tried to laugh it off, joking about Bigfoot or some mythical creature. But the more we saw them, the less funny it became. It started to feel like something was tracking us. But still, we pressed on. By the third day, that uneasy feeling had become something much worse. It was as if the forest itself had changed overnight. The light seemed different, darker somehow, even though the sun was still out. The trees felt closer, denser, like they were leaning in on us. And the shadows. God, the shadows. They were everywhere, moving between the trees, flickering in the corners of our eyes. But every time you turned your head, they were gone. We tried to ignore it, to tell ourselves it was just our minds playing tricks after being out here for so long, but it wasn't that simple. It's hard to explain unless you were there, but the air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on us, making it harder to breathe, harder to think straight. Eric was the first to say something. He'd been quiet all morning, more than usual, and then out of nowhere, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. We all froze, eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the same towering pines, the same rustling leaves, the same forest that now felt like it was hiding something. "What did you see?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. He hesitated before speaking, like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't real. There was someone or something watching us. It had these eyes, glowing almost, right over there. He pointed to a cluster of trees about 30 feet away, but all I saw was the usual darkness between the trunks. Rachel rolled her eyes, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just a deer or something. You're freaking yourself out, man." But Eric wasn't having it. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He wasn't the kind of guy to get spooked easily, and seeing him like that made my stomach drop. Matt, on the other hand, just kept staring at the ground, avoiding eye contact with any of us. We kept moving, but the tension was palpable. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. And those shadows, they weren't going away. I kept seeing them in my peripheral vision, flitting between the trees, always just out of reach. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. That night, we set up camp earlier than usual. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. The need to stop, to huddle together, as if staying in one place might keep whatever was out there at bay. We built a fire, though it did little to calm our nerves. The forest around us was too quiet, like even the animals knew something was wrong. As we sat there, Eric kept glancing into the darkness, as if expecting to see those glowing eyes again. Rachel tried to keep the conversation light, cracking a few jokes, but it fell flat. Matt didn't say a word the whole night. He just sat there staring into the flames, his face pale and tense. I wish I could say that's when we realized we should have turned back, but we didn't. That night something happened. I don't know how to explain it. And honestly, I'm not sure I fully understand it myself. All I know is that it started with a sound, a rustling, just beyond the light of the fire. You know how, when you're camping, every noise in the woods seems louder, more exaggerated in the dark? Well, this wasn't like that. This was deliberate, purposeful, like something was moving around us, circling just out of sight. Eric was the first to react. He stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the trees. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low, tense. We all had, but no one wanted to admit it. Rachel muttered something about the wind, but even she didn't sound convinced. Then we heard it again, that same rustling, closer this time. My heart started racing, pounding in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached for my own flashlight, my hand trembling as I flicked it on and pointed it into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, casting long, jagged shadows that danced and twisted as the wind picked up. But there was nothing there. No animals, no movement, just trees. And then Eric was gone. It happened so fast I didn't even see it. 1 second he was standing there scanning the woods, and the next, nothing. His flashlight lay on the ground, the beam still cutting through the underbrush. But Eric, he was just gone. No scream, no struggle, just gone. We all froze, our minds trying to catch up with what had just happened. I remember calling his name over and over, my voice shaking, growing louder with each repetition. But there was no answer, no sign of him. It was like the woods had swallowed him whole. Rachel started to panic, pacing back and forth, muttering to herself. Matt, still sitting by the fire, looked like he was in shock. He hadn't moved since Eric disappeared, hadn't said a word, just stared blankly into the flames, as if nothing had happened. I grabbed Rachel by the shoulders, trying to calm her down, but I was barely holding it together myself. "We need to look for him," I said, my voice shaking. "He can't be far. Maybe he got lost or... But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Eric hadn't just wandered off. He'd been taken. By what, I didn't know. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. We searched for hours, our flashlights flickering as we called his name into the darkness. But the woods were silent. Too silent. There were no animals, no wind, No sound at all except for the crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor. By the time we gave up, it was nearly dawn. Exhausted and terrified, we made our way back to camp, though it no longer felt like a safe haven. Rachel was in tears, muttering under her breath about going back, about calling for help. But something told me it wouldn't matter. We were too far out, too deep in the wilderness, and whatever had taken Eric, and it wasn't going to let us go that easily. That night I barely slept. Every sound, every whisper of wind through the trees made me sit up in a panic, expecting to see those same glowing eyes Eric had mentioned. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest, wrapping around us like a shroud. When morning finally came, there was still no sign of Eric. No footprints, no broken branches, no trace of him at all. It was as if he'd never been there to begin with. As we continued on the next day, it was impossible to shake the dread that had settled over us like a dark cloud. Every step we took felt heavier, like the forest itself was trying to hold us back, to keep us from leaving. Rachel kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide and frantic, while Matt hadn't said a word since Eric disappeared. I could see the fear etched into his face, but it was deeper than that. It was like he had retreated into himself, like some part of him had shut down after what happened. I tried to keep us moving, tried to pretend like we could still get out of this if we just stayed focused. But deep down, I knew we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows slipping between the trees just beyond our line of sight. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as a trick of the light, but the longer we hiked, the more frequent it became. Rachel was the next to go. We'd stopped for a break, just for a few minutes to catch our breath. I was sitting on a fallen log trying to figure out which direction to go next, when I heard it. This soft, almost rhythmic breathing. At first I thought it was one of us, but then I realized it was too close, too deliberate. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but all I saw were shadows dancing between the trunks. And then Rachel was gone. I didn't hear her scream. I didn't even see her leave. One second she was there, sitting on the ground a few feet away from me, and the next she was just gone. Her pack was still there, along with her jacket, but no sign of Rachel herself. Like she'd been plucked out of existence, just like Eric. Matt didn't move. He didn't even react. He just sat there, staring at the ground, his face pale and drawn. I could see the terror in his eyes, but it was like he'd given up. Like he already knew how this was going to end. I called her name, over and over, but there was no answer. The forest was dead silent, like it was mocking me, reminding me that we were completely alone out here. No one was coming to save us. No one even knew where we were. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind kept replaying the moment over and over, searching for some clue, some sign of what had taken her. But there was nothing, just emptiness. Eventually, I had to accept it. Rachel was gone, and now it was just me and Matt. I turned to him, trying to muster up some kind of plan, something that would get us out of this nightmare. But when I saw the look in his eyes, I knew it was hopeless. He was already gone, in his mind at least. Whatever had taken Eric and Rachel, it had broken him, but I couldn't give up, not yet. Even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, I knew there was no escaping it. Not really, because whatever was out there, it wasn't done with us yet. Matt and I kept moving, but it wasn't like before. Every step felt heavier, like the weight of what had happened to Eric and Rachel was pressing down on us. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion, though that was there too, but the mental strain of knowing we were being hunted. That feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when you know something is terribly, terribly wrong, and there's nothing you can do about it. The trees felt closer, the air thicker. It was like the forest itself was trying to swallow us whole. And Matt, he was slipping. I could see it in his eyes, in the way his shoulders slumped, how he barely reacted to anything anymore. It was like he was walking in a daze, moving forward because it was the only thing his body knew how to do, but mentally he was gone. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? Every noise, every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig sent shivers down my spine. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Always nothing. Just those damn shadows that seemed to shift and move whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. That night we made camp again. Not because we wanted to, but because we had to. We were too exhausted to keep going. The fire crackled weakly between us, but it didn't bring any comfort. I kept staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what was happening. I kept replaying everything in my head over and over, but no matter how many times I did, there were no answers. Then Matt broke. It happened suddenly, without warning. One moment he was sitting there staring into the fire, and the next he was on his feet screaming. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. Wild, terrified, like he was seeing something I couldn't. He pointed into the woods, shouting that he could see it, that it had been following us this whole time, just waiting for the right moment. I grabbed his arm, trying to calm him down, but he yanked it away, his eyes wide with panic. "It's right there," he kept saying. "It's watching us." I looked where he was pointing, but all I saw were shadows. Just like before. Nothing. He didn't listen. Before I could stop him, he was gone, running into the darkness, screaming at the top of his lungs. I called after him, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. I wanted to chase after him, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the realization that Matt was already lost. I sat by the fire for hours after that, listening to the wind in the trees, waiting for him to come back. But he never did. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the dying embers of the fire, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The forest around me felt more oppressive than ever, like it was alive, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every now and then I'd hear a noise, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I didn't bother looking anymore. I knew I wouldn't see anything. Matt was gone. I was alone. It's strange the way your mind works in moments like that. You'd think I'd be panicking, completely losing it, but I wasn't. I felt numb, hollow, like I'd finally accepted the fact that whatever was out there had already won. I don't know if it was the exhaustion, the fear, or just the sheer hopelessness of the situation, but I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. I knew I had to keep moving, though. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever had taken Eric, Rachel, and Matt to come for me. So I gathered my things, doused the fire, and started walking. I don't even remember which direction I was going. At that point, it didn't matter. Every part of the forest looked the same. Dark, twisted, and endless. The trail was gone, and with it, any sense of direction. I was just walking, hoping that if I kept going long enough, I'd find a way out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The forest wasn't going to let me go. The sun never seemed to rise. The darkness clung to the trees like a shroud, and even though I'd been walking for hours, it felt like I was stuck in the same place. The same shadows, the same silence. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to the others. To Eric, who had vanished without a trace. To Rachel, who had disappeared so quietly I didn't even notice until she was gone. And to Matt, who had run off into the woods screaming about something he saw. Something I couldn't see. As I walked, I started hearing things again. The soft rustle of leaves, the faint sound of breathing. But this time, it was different, closer, more deliberate. I could feel it, whatever it was, moving just beyond my line of sight, keeping pace with me. Every time I turned my head, it would stop. But as soon as I started walking again, it would follow. I don't know why, but I didn't run. Maybe I was too tired. Or maybe I just accepted the fact that running wouldn't help. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I could outrun. It wasn't something I could fight. It was something ancient, something patient. I don't remember when I first saw the footprints again. They were barely visible, half hidden beneath the underbrush, but once I noticed them, I couldn't unsee them. They were just like the ones we'd found around our camp days ago. Barefoot, impossibly large, and wrong. The footprints followed me just like the shadows. They were always there, just ahead of me or just behind me, like they were leading me somewhere. Or maybe hurting me. I kept walking, though, because what else could I do? I don't know how much time passed after that. Hours, days, everything started to blur together. The forest became this endless maze of trees and shadows, twisting and shifting around me like it was alive. It felt like I was walking in circles, no matter which way I went. My legs were heavy, my feet dragging across the dirt and leaves, but I couldn't stop. Not with those footprints always just ahead, always waiting for me to take another step. At some point, I lost track of where the trail had been. It didn't matter anymore. There was no trail, just trees. They stretched up into the sky like skeletal hands, blocking out what little light there was. The darkness was so thick it felt like a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Every breath I took felt shallow, like the air itself was trying to choke me. And then I saw it. I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't a person, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something else, something I couldn't comprehend. I only caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, moving between the trees. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like it wasn't used to walking on two legs. But what really got me were its eyes. Glowing, just like Eric had said. Two piercing yellow eyes that cut through the darkness like knives. I froze. My heart stopped. And for a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining it, that my mind had finally broken after everything that had happened. But then it moved again, closer this time. I could hear its footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the leaves underfoot. It was coming for me, and somehow I knew that there was no escaping it. I don't know how, but I managed to run. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my lungs burning with every breath. But I forced myself to move. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could feel it behind me, though. I could hear it. Its breathing, its footsteps getting closer and closer. I knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up to me. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. I don't remember how I got out. One minute I was running through the forest, and the next I stumbled out onto the main road. I collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air, my entire body shaking with exhaustion and fear. For a moment I thought maybe it was over, that I'd somehow escaped. But deep down I knew better. The forest might have let me go, but it wasn't done with me. I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the trees, watching, waiting, and those footprints. I started seeing them again, outside my house, in my yard. At night I hear rustling, soft breathing, just like I did in the woods. It's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know when it'll come for me, but I know it will. It always does. I never told anyone about what happened in the Cascades. What could I say? That something not human was stalking us? That it took my friends one by one and now it's coming for me? No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself sometimes. But every night when I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the soft rhythmic breathing just outside my window. And I know, deep down I know, that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. I was never the kind of person who craved danger. My work as a wildlife photographer was always enough of an adventure for me, capturing beauty in the wild without actually becoming part of it. But something about this trip to the Grand Canyon felt different. I'm not sure if it was the way my friends, Kyle and Sarah, insisted that we take the more secluded route, or if it was my own desire to capture something unique for my portfolio. Either way, I found myself agreeing, even though something gnawed at the back of my mind from the start. We were standing at the edge of the canyon, looking down at the less traveled path that Kyle had found in some obscure hiking forum. Untouched beauty, he'd called it, and yeah, it did look peaceful, isolated even. The kind of place where you could disappear from the world for a while, reconnect with nature and all that. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. Sarah, as always, was the first to push ahead. She had this carefree, almost reckless spirit that I envied. She seemed so eager to disconnect, like she was running away from something, but I never asked what. The hike started out just as you'd expect. Picturesque, serene, with the sun high overhead and a light breeze that made the heat bearable. We were alone, completely alone, or at least it felt that way. The usual groups of tourists and casual hikers were miles away, sticking to the safer, well-worn trails, while we ventured deeper into a part of the canyon that felt untouched. And it was beautiful, I won't lie. There was this raw, almost sacred energy about the place, the kind that makes you feel like you've stepped back in time, like you're trespassing on land that wasn't meant for you. Still, there was this nagging feeling I couldn't shake, like the canyon was watching us. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but the further we hiked, the more oppressive it felt. The sun seemed to linger too long in the sky, casting these harsh shadows that stretched and warped as we moved. Kyle kept talking about how perfect the light was for photos, but every shot I took felt off, like the angles were wrong or the shadows were too dark, too deep. There was this weight in the air, pressing down on us the further we went, and no one said it out loud, but we all felt it. I remember thinking that maybe we should turn back, but I didn't want to be the one to break the mood. Sarah was so enthusiastic, and Kyle had a way of convincing you that everything was going to be fine, that it was all part of the experience. So we kept going, pushing deeper into this gorge that seemed to swallow the sounds around us. The wind picked up, but instead of that refreshing open-air breeze, it felt wrong, almost suffocating. The further we descended, the less I could hear. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the wind. And then came the whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind shifting through the rocks, you know? That eerie sound you sometimes hear when you're out in the middle of nowhere. But these weren't just sounds. They were voices, low, distant at first, like an echo that wasn't really there. But the longer we hiked, the louder they got. And that's when I realized they weren't coming from around us. They were coming from somewhere deeper, carried on the wind, rising up from the canyon like it was breathing them out. I stopped to listen, half convinced that I was imagining things. But when I glanced over at Kyle and Sarah, their faces were pale, their eyes darting around like they were hearing it too. But no one said anything. We just kept walking faster now, like maybe if we didn't acknowledge it, it would go away. It didn't. The voices didn't stop, not really. They just shifted. What had started as distant murmurs soon became more distinct, almost human but warped, like the sound was being twisted by the wind before it reached us. It wasn't long before those whispers turned into something much darker. Screams, sharp and desperate, as if whoever or whatever was making them was trapped somewhere far beneath us, deep in the gorge. I wanted to ask Kyle and Sarah if they were hearing the same thing, but my throat felt tight, like the air itself had turned thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. We kept going though, I'm not sure why. Maybe it was denial, maybe it was pride, or maybe we all just assumed that this was some weird auditory phenomenon, something that could be explained away by science and logic. But as the canyon walls closed in around us and the sky above seemed to narrow, that explanation felt thinner and thinner. The air grew colder too, even though the sun hadn't set yet. It was that kind of cold that doesn't make sense. The kind that sinks into your bones and makes you feel like you've crossed some invisible boundary into a place you were never meant to go. I could see it in Kyle's eyes. He tried to play it off, cracking jokes to break the tension, but I knew him well enough to see through it. He was scared. So was I. Sarah, though, she was different. She kept walking ahead, almost like she was being pulled by something. Every time the wind picked up, carrying with it those tortured voices, she'd pause for a moment, tilt her head like she was listening to something none of us could hear. And then she'd keep moving, faster than before, like she was chasing something, or maybe being chased. It wasn't long before we lost the light. The sun dipped behind the canyon walls, leaving us in this half-darkness that made everything look distorted. Shadows stretched across the rocks, long and unnatural, twisting and writhing as the wind howled through the gorge. The voices were louder now, too loud to ignore, and every time the wind died down for just a second, there was this awful silence, this deep, suffocating stillness that made my skin crawl. We decided to make camp, hoping that a night's rest would clear our heads, that maybe the morning light would bring some clarity. But as we sat around the fire, I could feel it, this overwhelming sense that we weren't alone. Not in the usual way you feel when you're camping in the wild, aware that there are animals nearby, but something else, something watching. The howling started just after we got the fire going, a low, guttural sound that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to come from every direction at once. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, and judging by the way Kyle and Sarah's faces tightened, they hadn't either. We tried to ignore it at first, tried to convince ourselves it was nothing, but as the hours passed, the howling grew louder, more insistent, like it was circling us, closing in. Every time I looked into the darkness beyond the firelight, I half expected to see something, eyes reflecting back at me, or a figure moving between the rocks. But there was nothing, just the howling and the whispers, growing more and more desperate, until they seemed to blend together into one horrifying sound that made my stomach turn. And then it happened. 1 second, Kyle was sitting next to me, his face lit by the flickering firelight. And the next, he was gone. There was no sound, no struggle, just an empty space where he'd been, like he'd been swallowed up by the darkness itself. I screamed for him. Of course I did, but the sound barely left my throat before it was drowned out by the howling. Sarah stood up, frantic, her eyes wide with terror, but before she could take a step, something tore through the tents, slashing through the fabric like it was paper. We ran. We didn't pack up, didn't grab anything, we just ran. But no matter how far we went, the howling followed, always just behind us, always on the verge of catching up. We didn't stop running until our legs gave out. By then, the firelight was a distant memory, and the only thing guiding us was the faint glow of the moon, slipping in and out between jagged canyon walls. My lungs burned, my heart pounded in my chest, but none of that compared to the sheer terror that had taken hold of me. Kyle was gone. Not missing. Gone. I knew that with a certainty that chilled me to my core, and whatever had taken him was still out there, still circling, waiting for its next move. Sarah and I collapsed against a rock, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what just happened. But how do you explain something like that? How do you rationalize the fact that one of your closest friends can vanish into thin air without a sound? I couldn't shake the image of that empty spot next to the fire, the way Kyle's face had been there one moment, and then nothing. We didn't talk much after that. What was there to say? Every time we tried to speak, the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what we were dealing with. The howling had quieted down for the moment, but I could still feel it, this presence lurking just out of sight, biding its time. The whispers, though, they were still there, carried on the wind like a twisted lullaby, rising and falling in that same eerie rhythm. I could almost make out words now, fragments of sentences that didn't quite fit together but somehow made my skin crawl. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance, something I couldn't see. "We have to keep moving." I wanted to argue, to tell her we needed to rest, to regroup, to figure out what the hell was happening. But I knew she was right. Staying in one place felt like inviting whatever was out there to come for us next. So we stumbled to our feet and started moving again, following the narrow path that seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember from before. It was like the canyon itself had shifted, like the land had reformed around us, trapping us in this maze of jagged rock and shadow. The further we went, the worse it got. The howling returned, closer this time, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Every time I turned around, I expected to see something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But there was nothing, just the wind, the darkness, and that horrible gnawing sense that we were being hunted. And then Sarah stopped. She was ahead of me, her steps quick and frantic, but suddenly she just froze. I nearly ran into her, the momentum from my panic-driven pace carrying me forward. I started to ask what was wrong, but when I saw the look on her face, the words died in my throat. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, like she was listening to something. Not the wind, not the howling, but something else. Something I couldn't hear. I grabbed her arm, shaking her, trying to snap her out of whatever trance she'd fallen into. But she didn't move. She just stood there, staring ahead like she was seeing something I couldn't. "Sarah," I shouted, my voice hoarse, the sound of it swallowed almost immediately by the howling. "We have to go." But she didn't respond. And then, slowly, as if in a dream, she took a step forward. And another. I tried to grab her, to pull her back, but she shook me off with a strength that surprised me. It was like she wasn't herself anymore, like she'd become part of whatever nightmare we'd stumbled into. She kept walking, straight into the darkness, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on something just out of sight. I screamed her name again, but it was no use. She was gone. Not like Kyle. There was no sudden disappearance, no violent snatching into the shadows. She just walked away, walked into the night like she was answering a call only she could hear. I stood there, frozen, torn between chasing after her and running in the opposite direction. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't matter. Whatever had taken Kyle, whatever had gotten into Sarah, was too powerful, too insidious. There was no escaping it, not really. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the dark where Sarah had disappeared. Time felt strange in that place, like the canyon itself was warping it, stretching it out until every second felt like an eternity. I could still hear the whispers on the wind, louder now that I was alone, clearer than they'd ever been before. They weren't just voices anymore. They were words, twisted, disjointed words that didn't make sense but somehow felt like they were meant for me. I knew I should have run, that staying there made me a sitting duck for whatever was out there, but my legs wouldn't move. Fear had locked them in place, and the deeper part of me, the part that had already accepted Kyle and Sarah were gone, was whispering that it didn't matter, that I wasn't going to make it out of there, that no one ever did. But then I heard it again, that howl. Only this time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. Panic snapped me out of my frozen state, and I ran. I ran without thinking, without knowing where I was going. The path twisted beneath my feet, the canyon walls towering over me, and every time I thought I'd found a way out, the path would change, turn back on itself, lead me deeper into the gorge. It was like the whole place was alive, shifting and warping, trapping me in its endless maze of rock and shadow. The howling grew louder behind me, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through my chest, shaking me to my core. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. I just kept running, my breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps, my legs burning with every step. I could feel it getting closer, whatever it was. Feel it breathing down my neck, its presence looming over me like a dark cloud. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw it. A break in the canyon walls, a sliver of moonlight cutting through the darkness, an exit. I sprinted towards it, every ounce of energy I had left pouring into those final steps. I could hear the howling behind me, louder, more desperate, and I knew I was out of time. I dove through the gap, stumbling onto the rocky ground on the other side, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. For a moment there was silence. No wind, no whispers, no howling, just the sound of my own heavy breathing, echoing in the stillness of the night. I thought I was safe, but I wasn't. The silence didn't last. It never does, not in a place like that. At first it was subtle, the kind of quiet that makes you doubt your own senses. I sat there, gasping for air, my hands gripping the cold, hard ground beneath me, and for a split second, I let myself believe I'd made it out, that whatever had been chasing us was still trapped in the canyon, unable to follow me through that narrow gap. But then I heard it, the wind, not howling this time, not carrying those terrible voices, but something else, a soft, eerie hum that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of my own breath. It wasn't coming from the canyon behind me. It was coming from all around, like the very air was alive, pressing in on me, waiting for something. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me, trying to get my bearings. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, thin shadows across the rocky landscape. I could see the path ahead of me, leading up and out of the gorge, but something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there, like it was an illusion, a trick. I glanced back at the gap in the canyon wall, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing, just that same unsettling stillness, the kind that makes your skin crawl, like you're being watched by something just out of sight. I should have kept moving. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But instead, I stood there, staring into the darkness, listening to the wind as it whispered around me. And that's when I realized the howling hadn't stopped. It had just changed. It was quieter now, almost distant, but still there, still calling. I turned back to the path ahead, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see the faint outline of the trail leading upwards, the promise of safety just a few steps away. But with every step I took, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The air was too still, too cold, and the shadows, they moved, just at the edges of my vision, flickering and shifting like they were alive. I kept walking, though. I didn't have a choice. My legs carried me forward even as my mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back. I could feel the pull of the canyon behind me, the weight of it pressing down on my shoulders, dragging me back with every step. But I kept going, clinging to the hope that if I just kept moving, I'd make it out. But the further I went, the more everything around me seemed to blur. The rocks, the path, the moonlight, they all started to melt together, twisting and warping like I was walking through a dream or a nightmare. And that's when I heard it again. Not the wind this time, not the howling, but a voice, clear and unmistakable, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Rebecca." I froze. It was Kyle's voice. I couldn't believe it at first. My mind raced, grasping at any possible explanation. Kyle was gone. He'd been taken, swallowed up by the darkness back in the canyon. There was no way he could be here, calling my name. But there it was, clear as day, his voice cutting through the oppressive stillness around me. "Rebecca," he called again, softer this time, like he was standing just a few feet away. I wanted to turn around, to see him, to convince myself that maybe I hadn't lost him after all. But something in me knew better. Every instinct screamed that it wasn't him, that it couldn't be. But the sound of his voice, so familiar, so real, was impossible to ignore. "Rebecca, please." I turned, and there he was, standing at the edge of the path, half lit by the moonlight, his face just barely visible in the shadows. He looked wrong. Not in a way you could immediately point out, but wrong in the way shadows don't fall quite right in a photograph, or the way a memory sometimes feels off, even though you can't figure out why. His expression was blank, his eyes hollow, but his voice, God, his voice. It was exactly as I remembered. "Come on, Rebecca, it's safe. You can come back now," he said, his tone so casual, like this was all some joke, like we hadn't just been running for our lives. I took a step back, my stomach churning with dread. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the longer I looked at him, the more everything around me seemed to unravel. The canyon behind him seemed to shift and pulse, the shadows stretching and writhing like they were alive, hungry. And his face, it wasn't right. The more I stared, the more his features seemed to blur, like he wasn't quite there. "Rebecca." He took a step toward me, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was trying not to scare me, but I wasn't scared of him. Not the way I should have been anyway. I was scared of what was behind him, of what was waiting just beyond the edge of the light, hiding in the dark, using his voice to draw me in. "I found Sarah," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "She's with me. We're waiting for you." At that, I snapped back to reality, if you can call it that. I don't know what kind of twisted game this was, but it wasn't Kyle. It couldn't be. Whatever this thing was, it had taken my friends, and now it wanted me too. I took another step back, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But Kyle, or whatever was wearing his face, just kept coming, his eyes locked on mine, his voice soft and soothing. "Don't leave us, Rebecca. You don't have to be alone." The wind picked up again, colder now, sharper, and the howling returned, low and distant, but growing louder with every second. The whispers, too, rose up around me, swirling in the air, pulling at the edges of my mind, trying to convince me to stay, to go back, to let it take me. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to resist. The path beneath my feet blurred as I sprinted, the world around me twisting and warping as if the canyon itself was fighting to keep me there. The howling chased me, echoing off the canyon walls, growing louder, more desperate, until it was all I could hear. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't know if there was even a way out, if I was running toward safety or deeper into the nightmare. All I knew was that I had to keep going. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning in that place, and every step felt like I was moving in slow motion, as if the canyon itself was stretching out around me, trying to pull me back. The howling grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right on my heels. But I kept going, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air, my mind racing with panic. Eventually I stumbled, crashing down onto the rocky ground. My hands scraped against the sharp stones, blood trickling from my palms, but I barely felt it. All I could hear was the howling, circling around me, as if whatever was chasing me had finally caught up. I lay there for a moment, my chest heaving, too terrified to move, too exhausted to keep running, and then the silence returned. It was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like the world had gone dead. No wind, no whispers, no howling, just nothing. I pushed myself up onto my knees, glancing around, half expecting to see something looming over me, ready to drag me back into the darkness. But there was nothing. Just the empty, oppressive quiet that had haunted me since the moment we'd stepped into that cursed gorge. I was alone. For a brief moment, I let myself believe I'd escaped, that whatever had been chasing us, whatever had taken Kyle and Sarah, had finally given up. The path ahead of me was clear, the moonlight shining down, guiding me toward what I hoped was the exit. I could almost taste the freedom, feel the cool night air on my face, as I stepped out of that nightmare and back into the real world. But then, as I stood there catching my breath, I realized something. The silence. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was more than that. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, suffocates you, fills your head with a heavy, buzzing emptiness that makes you feel like you're drowning. It was wrong. And then I heard it. At first it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing, slow, steady, coming from somewhere just behind me. My heart lurched in my chest, my body frozen in place as I listened, straining to hear over the pounding of my own pulse. The breathing grew louder, more distinct, and with it came a low, guttural rumble, something between a growl and a sigh. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct I had told me to run, to get as far away as possible. But something about that sound, about the way it seemed to vibrate through the air so close I could almost feel it, held me in place. My body refused to move, trapped in that horrible moment between knowing I was in danger and facing what was behind me. Slowly I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat. And there it was. I don't know how to describe it. Even now, thinking back, it's hard to put into words what I saw. It was a shape, a figure maybe, tall, too tall, its body shrouded in shadow, its form twisting and writhing like smoke in the moonlight. It wasn't human, not even close, but it had the outline of something that once was. Its face, if you could call it that, was just a void, a gaping blackness where features should have been, and from that void came the sound, the breathing, the growl, the low, insidious hum that filled the air around me. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Just standing there, it exuded this presence, this overwhelming sense of dread that crushed me from the inside out. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. It was like the air had turned to lead, pressing down on me, squeezing the life out of my lungs. And then it spoke. Not in words, not really, but in my head I heard it, felt it, a voice, ancient and cold, crawling through my mind, whispering things I couldn't understand, things I didn't want to understand. It was calling me, drawing me in, just like it had with Kyle, just like it had with Sarah. I don't know how I managed to move, but somehow I did. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my body trembling with fear, but I forced myself to turn away from it, to run. I don't remember much after that, just the sound of my footsteps pounding against the ground, the ragged gasps of my breath, and that voice, that horrible, insidious voice, echoing in my head, chasing me down the path. I don't know how I got out. One minute I was running and the next, I wasn't. I was standing at the edge of the gorge, the moon high above me, the wind gentle and quiet as if nothing had happened, as if it had all been a dream. But I know better. It wasn't a dream. I wish I could say that making it out of the canyon meant the nightmare was over. But even now, standing in the light, miles away from that cursed place, I can still feel it. That presence, that voice, it hasn't left me. It's there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to slip back in. I tried to go to the authorities, to tell them what happened. They listened, of course, nodded, took notes, asked all the right questions. But when I got to the part about Kyle and Sarah disappearing, about the thing I saw in the canyon, they looked at me like I was losing it. And maybe I was. Hell, maybe I still am. They sent search teams, but they never found anything. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just our abandoned campsite and the trail leading deeper into the gorge. It's like Kyle and Sarah never existed. The hardest part is knowing that no one believes me. How could they? It sounds impossible, like something out of a bad horror movie. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to my friends. And I know that whatever took them is still out there, waiting for its next victims. I haven't been able to sleep since I got out. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it. The whispers, the howling, the sound of Kyle's voice calling my name. Sometimes I see him, in my dreams, or at least what I think are dreams. He's always standing at the edge of my vision, his face just out of reach, like he's trying to pull me back into that place. Sometimes I wake up with the taste of dust in my mouth, the smell of the canyon still clinging to my clothes, and the wind. It's different now. Every time it blows, no matter where I am, I hear it. Those voices, carried on the breeze, just like they were back in the canyon. It's as if that place never really let go of me, as if a part of me is still there, trapped in that endless maze of rock and shadow, waiting for the thing that lives there to come for me. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. There are days when I almost want to go back just to end it, to stop the nightmares, the whispers, the feeling that I'm being watched every second of every day. But I know what's waiting for me if I do. I've seen it, felt it, and I don't think I'd survive a second encounter. So I keep moving, keep pretending that everything's fine, that I'm just another normal person living a normal life. But the truth is, I'm always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that voice, for the wind to pick up and carry the howling to my ears again, because I know it's not over. It never will be. Not for me.
My name's Adrian Blackwell, and I've been climbing mountains for as long as I can remember. I was drawn to the challenge, the isolation, and honestly, the escape from the noise of everyday life. There's something about standing at the top of the world, nothing but the wind and the sky to keep you company, that makes you feel untouchable, like you've conquered something no one else can understand. But that feeling, that sense of control over the elements, over yourself, it can turn on you in an instant. I learned that the hard way. This story I'm about to tell you, it happened a few years ago. I've spent so much time trying to forget it, convincing myself that maybe it wasn't real. But no matter how many times I tell myself it was just in my head, the nightmares come back, pulling me into that thick, cold fog that surrounded us on Mount Rainier. You've probably heard of Rainier, one of the most majestic and dangerous mountains in the U.S. As it wasn't my first time climbing it, far from it actually. I'd been on that mountain more times than I can count, never had a problem before. But that last climb? It was different. It felt wrong from the start. I wasn't alone on this climb, of course. We were a group of 5, all experienced, all familiar with the terrain. We'd trained for this for months, mapping out every detail, every route, anticipating every challenge. But no amount of preparation could have readied us for what was waiting up there. As I sit here, trying to put these words down, I realize there's a part of me that doesn't want to relive it. But you need to hear this because it's not just about what happened up there on that mountain, it's about what followed me back. Sometimes I think if I could just make sense of it all, maybe I could sleep again, stop looking over my shoulder every time I step into the woods. But the truth is, there are things out there, things we weren't meant to understand. And once you see them, they never really let you go. It was early fall when we made our ascent. The air was crisp, the sky clear. It felt like the perfect day for a climb. But deep down, I had this nagging feeling, this little voice in the back of my head telling me something was off. I ignored it, though. We all did. After all, what could go wrong? We were pros, right? The climb started like any other. We met at the base, all smiles, eager for the challenge ahead. You could feel the excitement in the group, Ryan, Jenna, Max, and Sam, my closest friends, people I trusted with my life. We'd done this before, tackled mountains that made most people's knees buckle at the thought. But Rainier, despite its beauty, always had a way of humbling even the most experienced climbers. It had its own personality, its own set of rules, and we all knew better than to underestimate it. At first, everything was going as planned. The air was crisp, the views breathtaking, the mountains seemingly welcoming us with open arms. It was the kind of day you dream about as a climber, where every step feels like it's part of some larger, cosmic dance. We joked around, took photos, and talked about how we'd celebrate at the summit. There was an ease to our movement, a rhythm we'd all fallen into over the years. But as we got higher, that feeling of control started to slip away. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a heaviness that wasn't there before. The sky, once clear and bright, began to dim, as if the mountain was casting a shadow over us. I remember looking at Ryan at one point and seeing the furrow in his brow, that small sign that he was feeling it too, though neither of us said anything. You don't want to admit you're scared out there. Fear can mess with your head, and once it takes root, it's hard to shake. As we ascended, the air grew thick, almost oppressive. Every breath felt heavier, like the mountain was pushing back against us. That's when the fog started rolling in, slow at first, creeping in from the edges of our vision, then swallowing the landscape whole. You couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. It was disorienting, to say the least. The trail we'd been following, so clear and familiar, seemed to dissolve beneath our feet. The mist clung to us, cold and damp, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then we saw them. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Figures in the fog, human-shaped but distant, like shadows cast by something unseen. But as we kept moving, they became more distinct. They stood there, just out of reach, tall and eerily still, with no faces, no features, just blank forms that seemed to blend into the fog itself. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't say anything. No one did. We all saw them, but we were too afraid to speak, afraid that acknowledging them might somehow make them more real. We tried to keep moving, but every step forward felt like a step deeper into something we couldn't understand. The figures didn't move, didn't come closer, but they were always there watching, or at least it felt like they were. And the worst part. No matter how far we walked, how much ground we thought we'd covered, those figures were always the same distance away. We told ourselves we just needed to focus on getting down the mountain. That was the logical thing to do, descend before the fog got any worse, before the cold set in deeper. But something was wrong. No matter which way we turned, we couldn't seem to find the right path. It was like the mountain was folding in on itself, warping the trails we had memorized, leading us in circles. And those figures, they never left. They stayed in that mist, always there, standing, waiting. The group was starting to unravel. I could feel the tension in every breath, every glance. Jenna was the first to break. She started muttering under her breath, something about the shadows, about them knowing we were there. She wasn't making sense, and Sam tried to calm her down, but we were all on edge. Hell, I wanted to scream too. Every logical part of my brain told me this couldn't be real, that we were just tired, that the altitude was messing with us. But no one could deny what we were seeing. The panic crept in slowly, like the fog itself. We were losing time, losing light. Ryan kept insisting we were just a few hours from base camp, but we'd been walking for what felt like days. Our water was running low, and the temperature had dropped. The chill seemed to seep into our bones, making it hard to think straight. Max kept checking his GPS, but it wasn't helping. Every path we took felt like the wrong one. And those figures, God, they were always there. Not closer, not farther, just there, like some kind of living nightmare we couldn't escape. We started arguing. It wasn't like us. We'd been through tough climbs before, moments where tempers flared, but this was different. Fear was taking over. Jenna wanted to go back, retrace our steps to where we'd last seen clear sky, but Ryan insisted we push forward. Max was glued to his GPS, muttering about something being wrong with the signal, while Sam just stared into the fog, silent and wide-eyed, like he was seeing something none of us could. Then it happened. 1 minute, Max was standing there, tapping at his screen, and the next, he was gone. No sound, no scream, just gone. 1 second he was there, the next, the fog had swallowed him whole. I'll never forget the way Jenna screamed his name, the way we all started shouting, running in different directions, trying to find him. But there was nothing, just more fog, more silence. It was like he'd never been there at all. That's when the real panic set in. After Max disappeared, everything unraveled fast. It was like the mountain had come alive, twisting reality around us. The fog was thicker now, almost suffocating, and the cold had seeped into my bones. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. My mind kept racing back to those faceless figures. Were they behind this? Were they controlling the mountain, trapping us here? I didn't have answers, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt myself slipping into the same paranoia that had gripped Jenna. Ryan was trying to keep it together, but I could see the cracks forming in his resolve. He kept shouting for Max, his voice hoarse from the cold, but there was no response. The silence was unbearable, like the mountain itself was mocking us, feeding off our fear. Jenna was sobbing uncontrollably, muttering under her breath, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Sam had gone eerily quiet, his eyes fixed on the fog as if he could see something the rest of us couldn't. I tried talking to him, but it was like he wasn't even there anymore. His mind was somewhere else, lost in the mist. We had to keep moving. That much was clear. But no matter which direction we turned, it was like the mountain had reshaped itself. Every path led us back to the same spot, a cold, desolate clearing surrounded by those faceless figures. They were closer now, not by much, but enough to make my skin crawl. We couldn't keep running. We couldn't even think straight anymore. And then, just like Max, Jenna disappeared. I swear, I was right next to her. I could hear her breathing, could feel the panic radiating off her. But the moment I turned my head, she was gone. No sound. No straggle. Nothing. 1 second she was there, and the next, the fog had taken her. That's when I realized something. Those faceless figures, they weren't just watching us. They were waiting. Waiting for us to break, for the fear to consume us completely. And when it did, they took what they wanted. There was no escape from them, no fighting back. We were trapped, not by the mountain, but by our own minds. I was the last one left. Sam had wandered off at some point, his face blank, his eyes empty, like he'd given up entirely. Maybe he had. Maybe he thought if he just let it take him, it would be easier. I don't know. I wasn't thinking clearly by then either. Every step I took felt like it was in slow motion, like I was dragging myself through a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I remember calling out, but my voice barely made a sound, swallowed by the mist before it even left my lips. It wasn't just the fog that had thickened, something else had shifted in the air. It was colder, yes, but more than that, it was heavy. Oppressive. I could feel it pressing down on me, making every breath a struggle. The faceless figures weren't just watching anymore. They were closing in, circling me like they were waiting for me to break, to give up like the others. I could feel their presence, cold and alien, like something that didn't belong in this world, yet somehow had more power over it than anything I'd ever known. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. Days. Time had lost all meaning. My legs felt like lead, every step more difficult than the last. The silence was maddening. Not a single sound, not even the wind. Just my ragged breathing and the crunch of snow beneath my boots. And still, those figures followed, never closer than a few feet, but always there, always watching. I don't know why they let me live. Maybe I was just too stubborn, too broken to take. Or maybe they were saving me for something worse. But I remember collapsing, the weight of it all finally too much to bear. My knees hit the cold, hard ground, and for the first time, I looked one of them directly in the face, or where its face should have been. That blank, smooth surface, reflecting nothing. No eyes, no mouth, just emptiness. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The terror I felt in that moment was more than anything physical could have inflicted. It just stood there, inches from me, silent, unmoving. I was frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the fog began to lift. I woke up at the base of the mountain, alone. No sign of the others, no sign of those things. Just me, lying in the snow, the sky above clear and calm, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Something I can't explain, can't ever fully understand. They let me live, but they didn't let me go. I feel them sometimes, when the fog rolls in, when I'm alone. Watching. Waiting.